Okay, welcome everyone. It is noon in New York. As everybody knows, that's how I usually start most of these presentations. But thank you for joining us this afternoon or this morning from wherever you are coming from. Very excited about today's talk because we are taking a field trip out of New York for a little bit to visit Newport, Rhode Island, one of my favorite East Coast cities. And we are being led by author, architectural historian, and visiting curator for the Newport Historical Society, John Tschirch. He is going to be walking us through his newly released book, Newport, the Artful City, which is a gorgeous book. I know I've been saying that about a lot of the books that we have been featuring, but this is really quite a beautiful book that has been sitting on my coffee table and getting a lot of attention. If you are a lover of beautiful paintings, maps, I'm a big map lover, so this book is chock full of historic maps, most enjoyable. And again, if you are joining us, just say hello if you wish in the chat. We will be doing Q&A with John afterward, so please type your questions for him. Also, just a note of housekeeping for my insiders. This presentation and then the presentation tomorrow with Rena Toby will be the last of our meeting format presentations in Zoom. We are going to switch over to webinar officially after this week because of the ease of letting everybody in because of the waiting room situation. And so Robert Morbeck, good to see you. Jeffrey Bernard from the Upper West Side, good to see you. It's good to see a lot of familiar names today. I'm sure more will be streaming in. Also, just a reminder, we got an email this morning from an insider who said, oh my God, I didn't realize your archives are so exhaustive. Well, yes, just a reminder that all of our talks do go into our virtual archive forever and ever and ever. If you missed this or want to see it again, there it will land. Hi, Pete in San Francisco. Always good to see you as well. So, John, I am going to let you take it away from here, and I will see you guys at the end of the presentation for Q&A. Thank you, John. Go for it.
Thank you very much, Justin, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about this book, which is just newly published, called Newport, the Artful City. I have worked in Newport for over 25 years, and this book is very much the culmination of many ideas that streamed through me over time. And what is it? It's a look at the city of Newport in what I call an accidental work of urban art, because the city was never subject to one grand plan or one specific vision. It evolved over time. And what is left with us, what we are left with today, it truly can be seen as an entire urban work of art. Newport is one of the most historically intact communities in North America. Over 90% of it falls within a National Historic Landmark district. And so it has many tales to tell in its streets and its buildings. I have a two-part approach to the book and to this talk, and frankly, to everything I do in my writing. And that is, I chart the absolute physical evolution of the city, the hard facts. And the other half is its cultural meaning. What is the story? And so what I've charted is how Newport has inspired artists throughout the centuries who in many respects created a myth that is Newport as a historic place. They were all inspired by real things in the place, real geography, real architecture, real historical events, but they presented it through a romantic lens. And in many ways, it's a case study for approaching any built community with a long history. And I want to start with a quote that is in the book. It's in my preface. In 1973, the writer Thornton Wilder, famous for his play Our Town and The Bridge over San Luis Rey, wrote Theophilus North, and his story based in Newport. The main character is Theophilus North, and it's based in Newport in the 1920s. And here's a quote from the book. Theophilus is talking about Newport. I had been enthralled by the great Schliemann discovery of the site of ancient Troy, those 9 cities, one on top of the other. I found, or thought I found, that Newport, Rhode Island presented 9 cities, some superimposed, some having very little relation with the others, variously beautiful, impressive, absurd, commonplace, and one very nearly squalid. Well, that's a portrait in words of almost any city and the diverse character of almost any city. So let me take you through a series of maps, photographs, paintings, and other documents to paint a picture, so to speak, of this very artful place. Let's begin at the beginning. When European colonists first came to Newport, they came from Massachusetts Bay Colony. Rhode Island was founded upon the principles of religious tolerance, so it was quite different in character than any other New England colony. Many religious groups settled here. There was no one dominating religious force. When those colonists first arrived in 1639, as they said in the early records, to establish a plantation at Newport. And that word plantation, which is very culturally charged itself, actually meant working farmland at the time. And it's interesting, you know, in this recent election, Rhode Island voted to change the name of the state, to shorten it. The official name of Rhode Island, smallest state in the country, has the longest name. The original name was the State of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. We voted just to amend it. It's simply the State of Rhode Island now. They did not encounter, though, a virgin wilderness, as we think in the American myth. There had been Native American settlement on this southern tip of Aquidneck Island in Rhode Island, as far as recorded time. As early as 1524, Giovanni di Verrazzano, who was the Italian explorer, leading an expedition along the coast of the eastern seaboard of the present US. He was in the service of Francois I, the King of France. He sailed into Newport Harbor, which you see here in this map, and he called it Porto de Refugio. And he wrote of open land cultivated and the native inhabitants who would move from site to site depending upon the season. So he already recorded a settled landscape, a cultivated landscape by a people who had a very savvy use of natural resources. In 1639, those Massachusetts Bay colonists purchased the right from the native Narragansett tribe to settle here. The first thing they did, and if we see this map is what is one of the earliest and also one of the best maps of the city. You see it in the full flower of its colonial guise. It was done in 1777, so that's actually a year after the Declaration of Independence, and you see it at the height of its colonial wealth. Newport had grown into one of the 5 major seaports of British North America, along with Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. The plan was laid out, and they said, lay the streets out in a regular pattern. This is in 1640 by order of the town council, with free access to all the sea banks. And so here is Thames Street, the backbone, the spinal cord of the city, and Spring Street, which formed this grid of thin plots of land running from the waterfront uphill. This is a pattern of coastal settlement in New England specifically. You see it in Boston, Massachusetts, Salem, Massachusetts, all of the 17th and 18th century settlements. I think it's interesting in the map. It might be hard to read here, but in the book it's quite big. All the wharves are named, so the proprietor of that wharf was very important. You see a V-shaped section of town here. That's a triangular section. This is the early area of settlement. There was a natural spring here, giving the name to Spring Street. In 1680, this V-shape here was Long Wharf. The proprietors of Long Wharf, a corporate body, built the longest wharf in town. This became the main entrance to the city, physically and visually, looking right up here. Over here is Broad Street, which led out to the countryside. You'll notice, though, there's a bit of a grid here, but the streets are somewhat angled. All of a sudden, you see a perfect grid over here. In the late 1680s, Nicholas Easton, one of the founders of the town, who owned this called Easton's Point, bequeathed this section of town to the Society of Friends, the Quakers. And Newport had a large Quaker population because, again, they could settle here free of persecution. In the minutes to the Society of Friends, it's still in Newport. The Quaker said in Newport, "We must consult our brethren in Philadelphia." William Penn in 1682 had the plans of Philadelphia laid out in a perfect grid, with streets named after numbers and trees. And so in the point, Samuel Easton, Nicholas Easton's descendant, laid out the point, and it's named after numbers in this direction and trees, willow, elm, etc., which established that very American pattern of naming streets after trees thereafter. Now, Newport enjoyed this cultural flowering. It was a huge maritime port. Most of its profits, not all, but most of its profits were derived from the triangular trade in enslaved Africans. And so that is the dark stain on its history. In terms of the evolution of the town's civic splendor, as it was called, in the early 18th century, it was said that Newport had grown to, quote, the admiration of all. What we notice is the public buildings had to come after the street plan. This lists all the public buildings. This is Trinity Church. Up here is Redwood Library, all built in the mid-18th century, but they had to be inserted. They are not at the focal point of a grand town green or a town square. Why? Because freedom of conscience and capitalism reigned in this town. It was economics first, and so no one group dominated. Here is one of the, actually, it's a very early urban painting in American history. This is from 1808, and it shows Washington Square, that V shape. And you see, this now is turned into the parade with tree plantings. This is Brick Market, one of the main public buildings in town, again, built after the establishment of the town plan, and this is Long Wharf. So this evolved into the main urban axis of the city. What this does record are all the grand merchants' houses. They call them the merchant grandees of Newport, and Brick Market is one of the most elaborate public buildings built in America at the time in 1762 by Peter Harrison, who was armed with his Italian Renaissance books, especially those by Andrea Palladio, the Renaissance master. Palladio was discovered by English designers in the 1600s and then translated into English. And so Palladian pattern books, his pattern books are called Il Quattro Libri, the 4 books of architecture, became really one of the dominant pattern books for colonial American design. And this basically is an Italian Renaissance palazzo in the manner of Palladio, designed with open arcades on the first floor and assembly rooms. What's interesting is this Brick Market would become a constant landmark in what would become an evolving cityscape. With the American Revolution, though, there's a true shift in Newport. The economics of the town suffered. It became a bit of a sleepy backwater, which actually preserved it, because it did not industrialize in the early 19th century. It was surpassed up the bay, and in this old photograph, just keep sailing up the bay, you'll hit Providence, Rhode Island, which grew into the main city in Rhode Island, and it was linked to New York and Boston by railroad by the 1840s. When this photograph was taken, this is an 1845 daguerreotype. Again, it's one of the early photographs of an American city. Photography was in its nascent stages. For this photograph, they chose the oldest structure in Newport. Already, by the early 19th century, there was this idea that Newport was a historic place, even after it was only about a century and a half old. This is called Toro Park, and this is the stone mill. A legend was developed around this, that the Vikings built it, that Viking explorers came to the New World, and they called it Vinland. And this was their creation. The early Victorians very much wanted this to be America's Stonehenge, and the legend grew. Already it's the beginning of that sense of a historic mystique in the city. Later excavations found that it's basically a 17th century stone structure. It could have been a mill, it could have been a windmill. They're just not sure, but it wasn't built by the Vikings. But it's the myth that's important. And in the 19th century, how would the city develop? It develops as a summer resort. and it would become ever more fashionable in America as a summer resort. This is a bird's eye view of Newport in 1878. And you can see how the city has evolved, number one, but also the different emphasis. The earlier map, if I go back, truly focused on the harbor and the wharves as a great seaport, a commercial seaport. This bird's eye view takes the other direction. The foreground are the cliffs on the eastern side of town, the beaches, and all the booming summer cottages here. This is the core of the 18th century town. Wharves, the Quaker Point. But in 1853, with the rise of popularity in Newport as a summer resort in the early 19th century, the town developed this very fashionable street called Bellevue Avenue in 1853, which opened up all of the meadowlands for the development of cottages. And the poet, William Cullen Bryant, who was was an editor, a great poet, a great champion, by the way, in New York of Central Park, published a book called Picturesque America, in which he wrote about scenery. And mind you, this is the age of Romanticism, the worship of nature. Interestingly, at the same time, American industry is growing, and people were escaping to places like Newport with its old colonial past, its dramatic scenery. This becomes, William Cullen Bryant said, cottages, cottages. Newport is full of cottages of every variety, and every major American architect was descending upon the resort to build their own cottage. And then in 1867, this was laid out, Ocean Drive, a 12-mile circuit drive, which opened this up for summer resort expansion. And the early cottages that William Cullen Bryant talked about made reputations. This is an engraving of the first summer cottage in Newport, the Jones Cottage, later called King's Cote, designed in 1841. It is the embodiment of what was called the picturesque ideal in American culture. The picturesque vine-covered cottage, its elaborate Victorian ornament in this Gothic revival manner. It was done, the illustration was done by John Perry Newell. Every time a Newport cottage was built, he would make an engraving. And so this was a place to see and be seen. Bellevue Avenue was designed, we say, to see and be seen, to tempt and to taunt with the latest fashions. And here it's surrounded by its curving driveways and its assembly of asymmetrically placed, very picturesque trees. The architect was Richard Upjohn, an English architect. When he completed this design in 1841, he then won the commission in New York City to redesign Trinity Church on Wall Street. And he became the first American president of the American Institute of Architects, which was formed in 1857. His first secretary was the architect Richard Morris Hunt. So Newport became this laboratory for experimentation in domestic design by leaders in the field of American architecture, and a place to look to. Bellevue Avenue became so fashionable that Harper's Magazine often visited and stated that in Newport, quote, everyone, society is always on dress parade. And Bellevue Avenue became a theatrical backdrop. Here's the very beginning of the avenue, right near the 18th century town. This is the traverse block for stores designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the first American to graduate from the École des Beaux-Arts. He was based in New York. For example, he designed the base for the Statue of Liberty. He designed the entrance to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And then another generation right after, this is 1872. In 1879, this rose, the Newport Casino. It was not a gambling house at all. It was really a row of shops, a tennis club, a theater. It had a ballroom. It's really a country club. This is by the newly formed firm of McKim, Mead & White, the New York-based architects, who would make their reputation in Newport. And then, of course, this entire enclave was featured in Harper's Magazine. And here are the newly created streets in this whole fashionable 19th century district. Just off of Bellevue Avenue, all of the open farmland was subdivided and developed. So Newport is a story of picturesque and romantic ideals of being by the seaside, and also down to earth real estate savvy. Real estate speculators were king in Newport. And Alfred Smith was the most famous of them. And the New York Times reported in his obituary when he passed away in the late 1890s, he is the one responsible for Newport's quote unquote aristocratic thoroughfares. Brilliant marketing, because they were trying to develop this upscale resort. Here's a view of Ochre Point Avenue, right on the cliffs off of Bellevue Avenue, and this is a remarkable gatehouse to an estate built by Catherine Lorillard Wolfe. Again, a tobacco heiress who is based in New York. This is her summer house, and she called it Vinland in honor of that Viking myth around the stone tower in Newport. The gatehouse, it's in a rustic red sandstone, which she called Viking Revival. So high romance right on the cliffs of Newport. Then the other famous drive, Ocean Drive, and here's a photograph of it in 1867, which winds along the entire south coast of the city. Now, this area of Newport is known as a glacial erratic. It's very rare on the southern coast of New England to have all of these huge granite outcroppings. Obviously, in the antediluvian age, they were thrust from the earth, because in Connecticut to the west and in Cape Cod to the east, you have usually large, long, flat, sandy beaches. Rather than blast through the rocks, the developers chose to lay out the road respecting the natural topography. So it's a rolling series of, it's a curving serpentine road rolling in and around hills and valleys. This was being developed at the same time that Central Park was being designed in New York, the mid to late 1860s. Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, would be invited to come to this part of Newport in 1885 and lay out a road system in over 365 acres near here, developed by three families. And he wrote of the rocky promontories and the windswept eminences in this part of Newport. And he said, it is perfect for practicing the art of scenery. Frederick Law Olmsted was famous for not only designing his landscapes, but for the idea of integrating the view from that landscape, the borrowed view, the long distant vista. And he practiced in this. His sons, as Olmsted brothers, would design over 30 sites in Newport. Frederick himself designed 4. But amidst this picturesque summer resort, what was happening to the old town, the 18th century town? Well, we are in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, and this can be felt throughout almost every community in America. Here you see a very rare photograph that's in the collection of the Historical Society that's featured in my book, and it tells quite a story. Because on the left-hand side, you see new industry and inroads. This is the new railroad bed for the Old Colony Railroad, which arrived in Newport in 1867, the same year that Ocean Drive was laid out. And this is the steamship line that linked New York and Newport. It's called the Fall River Steamship Line. It would start in Fall River, Massachusetts, come down Narragansett Bay, stop in Newport, and go on to New York City. So Newport became part of an entire modern transportation, integrated transportation nexus. And this is at the edge of that historic neighborhood, the Quaker neighborhood known as the Point. And so in urban geography, you see two very different kinds of approaches. These are the 18th century houses and the buildings, the wharf buildings, the fishing shacks that go right down into the sea. Whereas the industrial landscape did landfill and over here, large cement embankments. Those are the two sides. And also in 1899, in the late 1880s, you had this electric streetcar revolution in American cities. And in Newport, the electric streetcar, arrived in 1899. Streetcars had been around for a decade or two, pulled by horses, but now this was modernity. And you see the electric lines coming in as well between 1895 and 1900, changing the cityscape. This is Spring Street, one of those two original streets in Newport from the 18th century. There was a hue and cry over this. Several people thought the streetcar would destroy the city. Already people were arguing about that age-old problem in cities, traffic. The Newport Improvement Association was founded by posh Newport summer residents, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, and the Belmonts. all hailing from New York. They wanted to keep the streetcar out of Newport. They felt it would destroy the city. And an article in the Providence Journal of 1899 said, I paraphrase, these industrial titans who make their fortunes from technology in the city don't seem to want the same technology in their summer paradise. The posh members of Bellevue Avenue lost their battle. Streetcars did come to Newport, but they did not go down fashionable Bellevue Avenue. They went to the beaches and to downtown. While this industrialization was going on in the old city, while fashionable new architecture was being built in the eastern and southern portions of town along Bellevue Avenue and Ocean Drive, artists and writers were beginning to rediscover and reappreciate the old colonial city. There's a remarkable, really truly remarkable series of photographs at the Newport Historical Society. This is one of them. They were commissioned in 1872 by the architect Charles Fallon McKim. He was the third American to attend the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the premier school of architecture in Western Europe and the United States. The first was Richard Morris Hunt. The second was the architect Henry Hobson Richardson. The third was Charles Fallon McKim. While he commissioned these photographs, he was working for Henry Hobson Richardson, and another young architect named Stanford White was also working for Richardson. McKim commissioned these photographs of colonial Newport, but not the facades of the grand colonial buildings. He was commissioning photographs of vernacular architecture, the everyday, modest shingled buildings of the colonial city. And here you see it at the very center of town, with the great Colony House at the very head of Washington Square, this building from 1740. But it was these buildings, because he was intrigued by this, and McKim, with Stanford White, was already experimenting with what would become the shingle style, these wood shingled houses with these remarkable gables. The photographs were taken by William James Stillman, who is also renowned for taking photographs of the Acropolis in Athens. And so there are over 25 photographs, and they're the earliest known photographs of colonial streetscapes. But what was happening on the other end of town at the same time? The rise of the great mansions. Newport had been a town of picturesque villas, Victorian villas like Kingscote that I showed you. All of a sudden in the 1890s, something new is happening in America at large, and it'll play out in Newport. Richard Morris Hunt, again, built this, Newport's first truly great stone mansion inspired by the chateau and stately houses and palaces of Europe. It is as if a classical city was being imposed on the earlier picturesque city. This is Ochre Court for the Galette family of New York, and Hunt based it on the great chateau of the Loire Valley. Straight drive, axial gardens. This was now the new era of palace building. The same was happening on Fifth Avenue in New York, on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, etc. It's no accident that when these great houses began to rise in Newport in the 1890s, that was the same decade that the United States surpassed England, Britain, and Germany, Britain, France, and Germany in the production of coal, steel, oil, and manufactured goods. America was now a world economic power. And like time immemorial, the new empire, the rising power, America, was building its own palaces. And of course, the satirists came as well. This is a drawing from Puck magazine by an artist called Raymond Ewer, and it's called A Sketchbook at Newport, what Puck's artist saw at society's summer capital. And of course, Newport was considered the ultimate resort of fashion by this time. For example, Vogue reported in 1909, what will she wear at Newport? The world was watching for fashion, for architecture. And here, what I think is so rare about a Puck illustration, however, it shows all aspects of Newport. Usually there are social commentary, satire, a few drawings, but here you have fashionable society assembling before McKim & White's Newport Casino. But you also have fashionable society, very rare, in their carriages riding by the rather crumbling, decaying old colonial quarter of town, here and here. And it says here, the old Newport and the new. This interplay of old and new would be taken by artists and writers constantly in Newport. The old cityscape, the new cityscape. Old manners and fashions, new manners and fashions. And one of the greatest artists and critics of them all was the American writer Henry James, who had summered in Newport as a young man with his family and then really had expatriated himself to Britain and Europe. But he came back to the United States in 1907. He visited Boston, Newport, New York, and later published his thoughts on America in The American Scene. First published in Scribner's magazine and then published as a book in 1908. This is what he saw. This is a view of Newport Harbor. I'll tell you about the house in a minute, but I paraphrase, Newport and its cliffs. He said, these cliffs, which reminded one of some dim-pillared ghost of a Greek island where shepherds should be piping away, instead has become a breeding ground for white elephants, where the pilers on of gold have built grander and grander houses. What Henry James was seeing on Newport's cliffs was a grand scale, a monumental scale, and opulence in American life that had heretofore never been seen. And in much of Henry James's work, he explores this idea of a pre-Civil War America, of Puritan values of restraint and thrift and moderation, and then the rise of America as a world power and its interface with the older, more sensual cultures of Europe. And here in this house, we see a temple on the cliffs. This is McKim White's Commodore Edgar House of 1889. In a way, it's the first of the classical houses in Newport. The locals nicknamed it the Acropolis because of its temple front, sitting on this rocky outcropping overlooking Newport Harbor. And here's the transformation. This is a photograph from 1900 of Cliff Walk. This is Ochre Court, the house I had shown you by Richard Morris Hunt of 1892. And here is the breakers from Cornelius Vanderbilt, of course, of New York City, the great railroad baron. The breakers of 1895, both by Richard Morris Hunt. Henry James went on in the sense of Newport, because what he did is he cast Newport really as a human character, with all of the virtues and vices of a human character: nobility, vanity, this opulence. And he concluded by saying that these houses, their owners one day would awaken as if from a witless dream and wonder what in the world to do with these buildings. And he said, and there will be nothing to do but to let them stand there vast and blank as witnesses to affronted proportion. Well, Henry James was no fan of these grand houses and what they represented, but they had transformed the cityscape of Newport. I'll talk about whether he was right or wrong and what happened to them a little bit later. He wrote that in 1908, and Newport began to think about the future. In 1913, the Newport Improvement Association, influenced by the City Beautiful movement and city improvements, commissioned Frederick Law Olmsted's sons to do an improvement plan for all of Newport. The sons, both Frederick Jr. and John Charles, created a series of these plans. What is interesting is they're highly comprehensive. They take in historic building stock, new areas of town, meaning the Gilded Age sections of town, the Victorian sections, open space, and the need for additional parks, and the importance of scenery, especially in a town bordered on three sides by water, with this entire southern zone with its cliffs. So this is Ocean Drive, Bellevue Avenue, and the colonial section of town. There's the border. The railroad comes right in here to the point, the steamships. Every subject the Olmsteds brought up would haunt Newport even to today. Traffic congestion, preservation of historic building stock, preservation of scenery. They took a series of photographs of the streetscapes. This is the point, that old Quaker district with one of the great colonial houses of the Quaker grandees, which, by the way, was restored by the architect Charles Follen McKim. They were also documenting the tree-lined streets of the town. This part of town, the Point, also conjured up romantic notions. The writer, excuse me, Wentworth Higginson, the writer, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, wrote a novel called Old Port, and in it, he romanticized the town. And he wrote of French officers who lived in this very house on the left, the Robinson House, during the French occupation of Newport in 1780. And Wentworth Higginson said, I can still see the glint of the Comte de Lauzun's sword and General de Rochambeau walking by. Both Henry James and Thomas Wentworth Higginson were romanticizing Newport in many ways. Henry James, in his sense of Newport, also said if one looked long enough, one could find the ghosts of the past lurking in town. These were romantics, but what they were writing about, what they were crafting, would have a direct impact on reality in the 20th century. Because by creating a romantic myth around the historic streets and buildings of Newport, by celebrating its scenery, they were ascribing significance to these places. And as the 20th century rolled on and urban renewal would raise its head in the mid-century, it was these districts in town that were celebrated by artists and writers, in painting, poetry, prose, and photographs, that would help preserve them actually. So that's what we'll be leading into. So for example, Newport lingered on, very little changed, until the post-World War II era. In 1944, actually, Life magazine visited Newport and wrote a story called Life Visits a Fading Newport. And in it, the reporter said, Bellevue Avenue, once one of the richest streets in the world, will probably never see the gates of its grand houses opened again. 2 world wars and an economic depression have finished it. Maybe Henry James' prophesizing was right. Maybe much of Newport would stand vast and blank. Maybe the colonial seaport would keep on decaying. We will see. A new aesthetic was emerging, a new value system in urban design, in architecture, at mid-century. And of course, that's the rise of modernism. And this cartoon in the Providence Journal of 1954 pretty much captures it. Here you see Rhode Island as a caveman wearing a pilgrim hat, which kills me, and a bone through it, is looking at the shining modernist city in the neighboring states, its cloverleaf superhighways, its high rises. There begins to be what I call both a battle and sometimes a dance between 2 opposing forces that develop after World War II. One is historic preservation, the other is urban renewal. They would bring up every topic the Olmsted brothers brought up, and what would happen? How would this play out? This was affecting every American city. Well, here is a photograph from 1900 of Thames Street, that main street along the water of the colonial wharves. It had grown into a Victorian commercial center. Layer upon layer, colonial buildings remodeled in the Victorian age, Victorian buildings. This would be the subject. This had fallen into decay, and this was the look of much of 18th century Newport. It still had the largest housing stock of colonial era buildings in the country. Newport is the largest surviving wooden British colonial American city, North America. But it still suffered from decay. And by the 1960s, so you have the aesthetics of modernism, which prized efficiency over historic picturesque qualities. It celebrated the new. You also had this idea that you could label something a slum and destroy it. And leave it to the New Yorker, the New York-based writer, Jane Jacobs, who fought Robert Moses against the destruction of Greenwich Village in the 1960s, and everyone with her in Greenwich Village, because it was going to be demolished for highway expansion. And her book in 1961, The Death and Life of the American City, would affect the whole preservation movement. It came to Newport in 1966, when federal funds were made available for urban renewal. Let's see what happened. In 1965, Newport had declared its historic district. Again, this is the historic district here. Here are the wharves of Thames Street. Here's the historic district, and that would be expanded here as well. This is the colonial city that was so celebrated by writers and authors for over a century. But it did not include the wharf area, which was considered more functional. So historic preservation here, and then this is the urban renewal zone, would have to live absolutely side by side. Urban renewal proposed the demolition of the entire wharf zone and the creation of a 4-lane highway coming through the town. There was a debate in the press back and forth. In the end, it happened. Here you see Brick Market, that great 18th century building which appeared and faces Washington Square, the same building you saw in that early painting. Here, the lone landmark from the colonial period surviving in the complete demolition of this wharf area with the new modernist Brick Market Mall beyond it. Here you see the completion of it. Here is, I'll find it for you, here is Brick Market. This line of Thames Street, here is the historic district. This is Washington Square. Here is the newly designed wharf area, open space. Now, having told this tale of destruction, this is only about 5% at the most of Newport's landmass. 95% of the city is historically intact. But this is an example of another chapter in the life of cities. New York had its experiences with this, Boston, Philadelphia, Hartford, Connecticut, you name it. This is the story of American cities. And which way would people go? Cleveland Amory wrote in the New York Times Magazine in 1963, he said, "The battle for Newport is on. Newport's Armageddon is here. Whichever way Newport decides to go, it will go," meaning it'll either embrace historic preservation or whole-scale urban renewal. In the end, only this small section was subject to urban renewal. And if one looks back at the town through its artist's eyes, much of the town is still intact. This 1860 watercolor of Washington Square by George Champlin Mason, who is an artist and writer in town and a photographer, is still the town you will see today. This is taken from the vantage point of all of us standing in front of the Brick Market, looking at Washington Square and at the Colony House, the same building Charles McKim photographed from behind. And if you walk on Cliff Walk today, this photograph from 1900 is still the view you will see today. Here's the breakers. The great houses did not stand vast and blank, as Henry James prophesied. He was right and he was wrong. They are not private residences. The Breakers is a house museum, a result of the preservation movement. Several houses are part of a university. Some houses are still privately owned, mixed use. But the point is, every leafy street, every windswept path, every town square tells a story of those forces that shaped Newport in its life. Colonial entrepreneurship and freedom of conscience. The Victorian picturesque ideal that capitalized on the landscape, the monumentality of the Gilded Age houses and their approach, and then the 20th century divergence into either both historic preservation, which felt you could save the original context, and urban renewal. That is the story. In the end result, Newport is, what is left to us is a work of urban art that I always say reads like a lesson from the past, a view onto the present, and a possible revelation of lessons to be followed in the future. So that's where I'll end, and I'm happy to open it up for questions, comments, observations.
Okay, thank you, John, very much. That was amazing. I am pasting once again for everybody the link to purchase John's book, because although this was a very thorough presentation, it barely scratches the surface of what's in the book.
There are many, many images, yes.
Yeah, including, the images, the pages are just spouting with great images and maps. But let me see if we have any questions here. Robert Morbeck said that he could listen to your soothing voice forever and ever. That's very
Thank you.
Robert Morbeck, by the way, John. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you very much.
He said the ballpark in the aerial shot is delightful. Also,
That is Cardine's Field, by the way, which dates to about 1900. It's a historic playing field.
Cool. Peter Tannen asks, when did the cliff walk open to public access?
Very interesting question. You know, it has been a right of way since 1640, when the town declared all sea banks will have free access. So it was always a dirt path. And then it was laid out in mid-19th century. There was an attempt to close it by the owners of summer cottages, but they were defeated because of that right. It's interesting. Ochre Point, you see here, one of the most exclusive enclaves in the United States, built by the most powerful people, had the public walking on their front lawns. America, God bless it.
I was just going to say that is somehow so strangely American in the way you put it. And also, of course, Newport is a very American city in the fact that it was a summer White House for two presidents, correct?
Yes, President Eisenhower lived at Fort Adams, and John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline lived at her family's estate, Hammersmith Farm.
Right.
By the way, there's a strong tradition in Rhode Island in general of access to sea banks. And so there's a great deal of public access to the seashore throughout the state of Rhode Island as well. That goes back to the colonial period.
Awesome. Any other questions for John regarding Newport's history? John, I think I shared this with you when we spoke last week, but I had gone to Newport many times with my family on the way up to Massachusetts. And the first time when I was a kid, we stayed at the Viking. Mm-hmm. And of course, I was always wrapped up as a history-loving child in the idea of the myth of the Viking sort of landing. Yes. At Newport. And I have to say, I know I've burst a lot of bubbles in my work of tours and writing, and that was one of the biggest bubbles ever burst when I was a teenager and found out that the Stone Tower was indeed not a Viking tower.
But you know what's great? There was a Viking tuxedo rental, a Viking dry cleaning store, the myth, and this location of the Viking Hotel, I write about it in my book, that was literally on the corner of the colonial town with the Jewish cemetery next door. And it was the site of Richard Morris Hunt's summer cottage originally, the man who transformed Bellevue Avenue.
Wow. And actually on this talk is, and I hope Robin doesn't mind that I bring her up because she just sent me a text, Robin Roth Moyes, who is the great-great-granddaughter of, the great-granddaughter, I'm sorry, of Emery Roth, who got his start with, as she said, William Morris Hunt.
Interesting.
And Robert Morbeck asks, do you have any memory of Chicken City, crazy all-night place where the ashtrays were labeled stolen from Chicken City?
Yes, it's a shame. It was on West Main Road leading out of town, and it was a wonderful bit of pop art. I mean, neon signs, mid-century neon. It was demolished, and it was only demolished maybe 10, 15 years ago at the most. It's a shame. One of the sad things on Thames Street, when they demolished it in the 60s, there was a whole row of neon signage. It served a populace of all the sailors when Newport was the home of the Atlantic Fleet. And of course that all went. And if it was still there, who appreciated it in the 60s? It was too recent. Now it would be the most popular zone with this remarkable signage from the 40s and 50s, wiped away. That's a great loss. One other point I'd like to make in my book, it goes into more detail, but I cited Jane Jacobs, but the other author I cite is Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, because in a city like Newport, Rachel Carson's work, which really incited the environmental movement, and Jane Jacobs, talk about the historic preservation movement, 1 year from each other, what they basically were doing is taking a holistic approach to your environment. Rather than demolishing cities because you call them slums because they're diseased, and DDTing every living thing to get rid of mosquitoes, it's that idea that you blow up everything and you rebuild it. They were saying, no, you observe things carefully, watch the life system, and to do clinical interventions. And I put the two together in the book because look at this photograph. Newport's urban cityscape is both natural scenery and architecture interfacing. And that was very important to me to bring that out in the book. And of course, I go into that in more detail in the text towards the end.
Yeah, it's very thorough. As I went through it, because I'm also very interested in urban design and, of course, the history of urban renewal, especially as you mentioned, all of the post-World War II attempts at urban renewal. Of course, we know New York was probably one of the most heavily exposed to that. But it's a very interesting balance. And Newport, I didn't realize until I read your book how close Newport came to having a lot more damage done to it. But we think of Newport as and it is a very well preserved city. But I didn't even realize they did any of these initiatives down.
That's why I wanted to tell that story. Yes, to say
it's a very interesting. Again, I always say there's a lot of mirrors between New York and Newport. Very much so. Let's see. You're getting lots of wonderful praise here, John. Having toured Newport, Peter Tannen says, having toured Newport for several days, I really enjoyed your wonderful presentation. Thank you. Robert Morbeck once again said this presentation was absolutely tremendous. Thank you. Michael Caine, another New Yorker writer, Rachel Carson, Silent Spring was originally a 4-part series in the New Yorker. I did not know that, Michael Caine.
That's interesting. I did know that in the New Yorker. That's interesting.
I did not realize it was a 4-part series in the New Yorker. Thank you, Michael. I love Silent Spring. We had to read it in high school, and I was, totally like, as a high school kid, I was kind of like, all right, good points. But, and then getting into urban history and urban planning, urban design later on in my life, it was just such an amazing rediscovery. So important. Any other questions for John before we do our wrap up here?
And Justin, can I mention one thing?
Yes,
in terms of what I'm doing now? I'm working on my second book on Newport. It's called America's Eden, Newport Landscapes Through the Ages, where I'm talking about both the artistic, cultural, and horticultural importance of the city. So my fascination is with whole places now, the whole urban design of the city, the whole landscape. And that's something that's very interesting to me. So that won't be coming out probably till January of 2022. It's a year off. So.
Oh, well then.
Stay tuned.
We'll have you back. We'll have you back to do that one.
Lots of New York connections there too.
Yeah, hey, that's awesome. And you and I spoke about this, I think, before we let the group in. That is the trend now in urban design and urban history, doing a holistic look at how everything fits together. It's something I always try to do too when I'm doing a tour. It's, past, present, future, and how design influences a neighborhood or city as a whole. It's the way to do it now.
Yes.
I think so says me.
I agree.
All right. So says John too. So we have a unanimous vote here. Well, thank you, John. For our insiders, and again, if you have any other questions while I'm rattling off what's next, please feel free to continue to put them in the chat if there's something you forgot. But tomorrow, I believe she's even on this talk. Rena Toby, art historian and insider herself. I think this may be the first insider-driven presentation we will be having. Tomorrow, Rena Toby is taking us through modern life in the modern city, art in New York, 1900 to 1945. Rena, I'm really excited about this because I've met Rena on many tours before and of course through insiders, but I'm really excited about her presentation. I love this period in New York art. So I hope I see all of you guys there. It is at noon tomorrow. And then on Thursday at 3 p.m., we are doing a virtual tour with Brick and Wonder of the Woolworth, the absolutely phenomenal Woolworth residence at the top of the Woolworth. And I'm very excited about that. Brick and Wonder is hosting, but you guys are able to attend through us to Brick and Wonder. Or if you're a Brick and Wonder member, you can go that way too. I will not be hosting, but I will be watching. And then next week, very excited. The listing is not up. And this is an in-person event for insiders in New York, but I will be filming it and putting it on the archive. We are going to the Philip Williams Poster House in Tribeca, which is an amazing, amazing site. Over 500,000 pieces of ephemera and posters that this man has been collecting since 1973. He's taking us into the basement and the sub-basement. I've been there. It's a historical treasure because The sub-basement foundation is definitely from the 1700s, and his collection is out of control. And for the 10 insiders that sign up, you are able to go on the website with the link that will be in the listing and choose something for Philip to pull for you to see in person that day. So if you're in New York, it's next Tuesday at 5 p.m. It's in Tribeca on Warren Street. It is going to be a lot of fun. And I will be there filming for those of you who are virtual. We cannot live stream because the signal is abysmal downstairs, but I will be filming the whole tour and putting it together and putting it in the archive. Rena says, thank you, Michael. Robin says, great talk today. Looking forward to tomorrow's talk and the Woolworth one. We do have a good week, and next week is packed as well. Thank you all very much. Thank you, John. Any final thoughts, John, before we let you go?
No, just thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure to share this.
Oh, it's been our pleasure to have you. And thank you, everybody, for attending. Have a really great afternoon, and stay safe, guys. Have a good one. Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.